It's a fascinating idea that many journalists who grace our TV screens are household names, and yet they're famous for commenting on what other people are doing rather than being the subject themselves. Having said that, my guest today could well have taken centre stage while working as a journalist in Uganda. He flew alongside President Idi Amin in the presidential jet, and he recounted how, whilst Amin appeared to be asleep, he thought seriously about taking Amin's revolver and shooting him dead, but was a tad worried about the consequences of firing a loose round in a jet. Well, perhaps it's no coincidence that his autobiography is called Shooting History. Jon Snow has been the face of Channel 4 News since 1989, and from that time he has travelled the world over to cover iconic world events from the fall of the Berlin Wall and the release of Nelson Mandela to Barack Obama's inauguration and the devastating earthquake in Haiti. His many awards include the Richard Dimbleby BAFTA Award for Best Factual Contribution to Television and the Royal Television Society Awards for Journalist of the Year and Presenter of the Year. But anyway, this is just the tip of the iceberg because Jon's greatest achievement was realised earlier this year with the birth of his son. So, from the landscapes of war-torn areas and conflicts and elections to now baby rattles and gurgles, I'm keen to see how listening has played a part in Jon's extraordinary journey. And goodness me, Jon, it really has been an extraordinary journey. And I feel, to be honest, quite intimidated talking to you because I'm not the most eloquent with words. I'm not a professional interviewer or anything like that. But, you know, your life has fascinated so many of us. And I'm just curious now, with the birth of your son, how that has changed your life.
Well, I'll come to that in a moment. But I just want to make this interesting point that I think conceivably we have more in common than you may imagine, you and I. Because actually, my route to listening was music. My
Yes.
mother was a concert pianist, and my father was an extremely dominant figure who didn't really have much time for me, that had a lot of time for my brothers who were very technical. He enjoyed technical things. But my mother played the piano, and very quickly I began to stand beside the Blüthner, beautiful, which I own to this day,
Oh,
piano, and I would pick up harmonies and main tunes in music that she was playing. Uh, and I remember at about the age of 7, hearing my mother say to my father, "George, the boy can sing." And
brilliant.
at that moment, they decided to put me in for voice trials to see whether I could become a chorister
Mm.
in one of the cathedrals. There could, as far as my father was concerned, only be one cathedral that could be considered. Now, that would have to be Winchester, because he went to school at Winchester College.
Aha,
Um,
indeed.
and so I was put in for the voice trials at Winchester, and I prevailed. And Alwyn, appropriately named Surplice, um, took me under his wing, and I learnt not only to sing, but above all, and you know this better than I do, to listen. Because music
Absolutely.
is as much about listening in terms of its performance as it is about playing or singing.
It is. That's so fascinating. And I suppose the use of the voice more
Mm.
than anything, because it's something internal that has to be then, you know, made into this emotional sound painting in a way is even different than if you pick up an object like a violin or a marimba or whatever. And has singing remained important to you during your life?
Extremely important. I mean, I sing a lot, if not in the bath, certainly in the car. I mean, anywhere that I'm alone, I let go. But because of the nature of my job, I don't really belong to a choir or to any
No.
method for delivering song.
But now you
And,
do. You have your son now.
and now I've got my son. I'll be singing to him extensively. Um, I have two daughters, an earlier marriage, and I will be singing to them as ever and to their children in turn. Um,
Absolutely.
it's a gift, and it is a gift as much about listening as it is about performing.
It is a gift, and I suspect that, with the extraordinary travels that you've had over the years, that you have experienced so many bridges being built through music. I think that with your passion towards music, you've no doubt kept your antennae fairly sharp in that regard.
Well, yes, and when I was sort of 18, I volunteered as a voluntary service overseas teacher. Um, Gosh, what I had to teach, I don't know, but anyway, I was selected and sent to Uganda, which is
Mm,
how I ever came to have anything to do with Idi Amin, um, although that was to come much later.
yeah.
And I found myself in the most extraordinarily beautiful spot on the banks of the Nile, about 50 miles north of Lake Victoria, in a school with some 500 secondary school children in it. Uh, I was one of only three Mzungus, white men. Um, One was a fellow VSO, and the other was a priest running the school.
Mm.
And otherwise, the teachers were African or indeed Asian. And for me, it was absolute and total bliss. And the music there, which was generated by the children themselves,
Mm.
was of a very high and wonderful order. So music never left me.
And it's interesting that because I've only made a couple of visits to Africa as a patron of Able Child Africa, and we went into a primary school in Nairobi, and I could not believe how extraordinary their music making was. I mean, it's just so innate to them, their voices, their expression, it's their daily medicine. It truly is. And I've never seen such young children, express themselves in such an extraordinary way. And this idea of involving dance, movement, it was a school who also incorporated sign language. It had a mixture of deaf and hearing kids. And this was all just simply a language. It was all about building bridges. And that had a powerful effect because, of course, we're talking about, music education in this country and, how we're lacking it and it's disappearing and this and that and the
Mm.
next thing. And how extraordinary it is to see this environment in a school whereby it is an absolutely, there's just no question that they must do it every day.
And you could be safe in believing that that school would not have been unique, even though it was obviously dealing with a specific element of
Mm,
education. But
mm,
uh, I never went to a school in Uganda which didn't have this extraordinary musical fiber in their souls. In I'm sure it's all here for us to rediscover too, but there it hasn't left them. It's still an
mm.
absolutely core element of Africa. Music, music, music.
It is. And I wonder, there seems to be a surgence of folk music during this past year, especially. People have tapped into what is the music of my area? What is the music of where I live? And people have actually, engaged with that. And this is what's so beautiful about this country. We've got such great, amateur musicians, strong amateur scenes with choirs, brass bands, orchestras, you name it. And it's interesting because I wonder if folk music is in fact our classical music.
Hmm. Well, it is an absolutely extraordinary thing, and I think the point I would also want to make, which kind of takes me to who I am, I suppose, is that it taught me so much about speaking,
Ah,
about consonants,
interesting.
about vowels, about absolute clarity, and about pace, all of which is so important if you're going to communicate satisfactorily as a teacher, as a politician, as a leader, as a manager, as a worker. We need
Mm,
language. And in many ways, in our highly developed world, uh, it's kind of withered a little bit. And it's when you go to continents like Africa, which it's absolutely universal in Africa, that both
Mm.
song and the words are clear, musical, have wonderful tone. It's extraordinary.
It's a wonderful thing you've said there, actually. Very powerful indeed, because when we think about nursery rhymes, you know, we're babies and we're rocked in our mother's arms or our
Mm.
father's arms, and you know, this rhythm, the pace, the presence of the sound and so on is so amazing. And you're right, I wonder if social media is dissecting the ability to listen to the color of sound and therefore the message. We're missing the almost the how can I put it, the facial expressions of you know, here we are, we're communicating via Zoom, but I can only see half of you, and you could
Mm.
no doubt probably see only half of me. So, but thankfully I can see your face, and which is hugely expressive. But at the same time, it's still not quite the same if we were in the same room, you know, and
Mm.
we could see the whole engine, as it were, expressing themselves. But I do wonder if social media has changed, I suppose, the way that journalism and how the messages are being put across. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. The instant is not necessarily the best way of communicating. It's
Mm.
perhaps a moment when you should have some consideration before you actually deliver what you want to say. And very often I found it myself that communicating on Twitter or you know any of these systems, um, whether I've rushed to performance before
Mm.
I'm ready because I've just thought it and it's gone out. Um, and of course, again, this is the beautiful thing about music. Music can be spontaneous, of course, but kind of organized music necessitates some rehearsal, some thought processing, even before you even get together to perform. Um,
Mm.
I, I, I mean, I love the social network because I love the capacity to be instant and first and all that. But at the same time, I can see it has a potentially destructive power too.
And I think that, you know, what you've said about, in a way, reflection, because
Mm, mm,
our instinct is to see something, read something, and immediately act on that, and as opposed to just letting it simmer, which is
yeah.
obviously what we do with music. Even, I suppose, with improvisation, even although it's spontaneous, we do actually still allow an idea to be molded and
Mm,
played around with and, you know, explored before we go wham, you know, right, this is it now.
mm,
You know, so that's in a way interesting. But I've certainly found, you know, in my own situation as a musician, I've really tried to consciously stay clear of looking at other performances, looking at other interpretations, and that kind of thing, because I think the eye is very quick to pick things up more than the ear is. So I feel that you can be influenced by what something looks like, how someone might be playing something, as opposed to the sound of it, because the sound quality is still relatively substandard, you know, through a computer or a laptop or something.
Although there is still an extremely positive relationship between the eye and the ear, in the sense that you can see something, you can even hear it, and then you can consider it and decide what was important about that particular experience. And that, of course, is why I absolutely love the job that I do, because I see and hear a lot, but I don't have necessarily immediately to toss it out and inflict it on the listener or viewer. I've got time to consider it and even shape it and write it,
Mm,
or simply organize it in my head and be ready
mm.
to unload it, um, which of course is very counter to the the sort of communications that we're talking about in terms of the digital age, and all that instant. And that, of course, is the beauty of music, the fact that it, in a sense, to make sense, music has to be organized.
Yes.
I mean, you could, of course, have a jam session if you like, and see what happens. But in the main, we're talking about something highly organized, which has involved both the excuse me, which has involved both the ear and the eye before being inflicted upon the listener or the viewer.
Absolutely. And I suspect that your senses are absolutely razor sharp at the moment as you observe every tiny movement of your son and, picking up on every tiny little thing that he projects, to you, wondering if he's hungry or if he's sleepy or, which is quite lovely.
Although the mother has the upper hand at this sort of stage. I think she's probably seeing it before I even get a chance.
It needs to be teamwork there, Jon.
Indeed.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you have had an extraordinary career and you've traveled the world and, attended such pivotal events in modern history. And, but, was there something in your childhood that made you so forward looking or made you curious about people's stories? Did you find that you were listening in a certain way, as a young child? Where did this interest come from?
I mean, I loved him, but he was a very dominant figure. My father, he was 6'7".
Ooh.
He had big with it. And he was a bishop, so he was 8 foot in a mitre. He was a formidable figure, and I couldn't pretend that I ever had a very close relationship with him, although I loved him. I didn't have a problem with him. But it wasn't the kind of relationship that many people have enjoyed with a parent that is perhaps slightly more emotionally engaged in communicating with you. So I think I looked, oddly enough, it triggered in me a need to be more expressive, more engaged with other human beings, to find out what they thought. And that avenue with my father wasn't really very, very open. He was buried in the Times at breakfast, reading it. And that really was the way the day unfolded. Sometimes when he went on a walk, you could get a little bit, but not much, where it related to the hazelnuts that you could see on the bushes along the way. But in terms of kind of emotional engagement, there was very little. I had quite a lot with my mother, largely because of her music. I think that was the absolute. I mean, she'd been to the Royal College of Music. She was a really fine pianist, but she'd had a terrible setback in life, which I don't think she really confided to anyone other than me to some extent. And that was that she, in the course of her performances as a student at the Royal College, she lost all her hair. She suffered alopecia totalis, which in a woman is bad enough for a man, but a bald man is hardly noticeable. But a bald woman is a very different thing. And
absolutely,
even if you've got a wig, and particularly because you've got a wig, it's something disabling, definitely. And yet nobody would say you were disabled because you had no hair. But in a funny sort of way, she was disabled by it, mentally to some extent. And although she never really confided in me about it, I think she said in the car one day driving off, of course, my father, being the sort of man he was, had an open sports car in which 3 of us were crammed in the back. My poor mother would have a Jack Ma scarf tied tightly under her neck to keep the hair on in the passenger seat. He'd be revving along the road, loving every minute, and she'd be dreading that it might blow off. But there we go. But I had that bond with her, which was partly a kind of sensitivity to her need, and partly the music above all. And it was something that my two brothers didn't have to quite the same extent. And I recognized that. And then, I was lucky enough to get into that choir at Winchester Cathedral and bask for 5 tender years, from 8 to 13,
How
in
wonderful.
the most glorious music. I mean, it's the best start a child could ever have, except, of course, you were separated from your family and had to be in a boarding school and all that, which I wouldn't necessarily rate very highly as an experience. Although it did give me the sort of independence which I was able to depend upon later in life as a journalist.
And did you find whilst at school that you conformed to the structure of the school, or did you feel a sense of, oh, I just want to stretch my elbow a little bit, I want to see?
I'm afraid I did a lot of stretching. I was caned quite often. So, but that was the way it was. And I think if you weren't very interesting.
Yes. How fascinating. And when you decided to, I mean, you first of all went in to study law at Liverpool University.
Yeah.
What was the intention there? Had you a specific aim towards that line of a
No,
career?
I'm afraid to say I had absolutely no interest in it at all. But my father, this is such a dreadful story. My father was on a train and found himself sitting opposite a man who turned out to be the professor of law at Liverpool University. And my father, being a headmaster at the time, obviously chose the moment to brag about a boy he regarded as being a complete dunce. But anyway, and by the end of the train journey, I think the professor had effectively agreed to take me. And I got in. I mean, that was that. But I had to read law, of course, which I didn't find the most elevating. Although I have found it useful, in my work. I've sort of understood processes and things. But yeah, I mean, but of course, the trouble is, I soon forgot his generosity in getting me into the university and started trying to change the university. I mean, this was a time of great, there was lots of student revolution going on across the country. It was in the, late 60s. And it's still happening today to some extent, but we objected to the fact that the chancellor of the university was a man named Lord Salisbury, who was very much of the old colonial dynasty. Indeed, his family had given the name Salisbury to the capital of Rhodesia. We concluded and students were definitely up in arms trying to change things. It was a period of great change, the 60s. And we concluded that the chancellor wasn't really a fit and proper individual to be the chancellor of a multiracial, multicultural university, and that he should go. The university didn't agree. We had a sit-in in which I was very prominent. And when it was all over, indeed the chancellor summoned me, and I went to see him, and I said, I'm sorry, but it just doesn't fit with what the university is all about. And he said, well, very well, I shall resign.
Ooh.
And he did.
Goodness.
But they had my guts for garters, and I was disciplined and sent down. That was it.
How extraordinary.
I never got a degree, but subsequently, a wonderful thing happened. I was appointed much later in life as Chancellor of Oxford Brookes University, despite the fact of not having a degree myself. And there was a wonderful Vice-Chancellor there who subsequently got translated, as I think we could put it, translated to Liverpool University. And one of her first actions was to give me an honorary doctorate, which I grabbed with great enthusiasm.
That's a brilliant story. And I mean, thinking about this past year whereby, students have been turned upside down with the pandemic and so on, and a lot of listening has had to happen with the students. That needs to happen anyway, really. But, it's I think what's become very apparent this past year is making sure that those bridges between the staff, the people who provide in the universities and establishments are really listening to students, and they are the change makers of the future at the end of the day.
Well, and my evidence in talking to a lot of students in these last months has been that they have felt very under cared for. There was the awful scenes at Manchester University where railings were put up to keep them in there, and on the basis that you shouldn't let intruders get in and the rest of it, but they felt imprisoned by it, and it wasn't a clever moment.
Absolutely. And how important do you think that the personality of a journalist is? I mean, when we watch someone on television, they're delivering facts and information and so on. And how important is it to be very neutral visually, or do you feel that it's absolutely essential for the personality of the journalist to come through?
The personality cannot be allowed to get in the way of facts. That I accept. But I think at the same time, you have an obligation to the people you're investigating or reporting or describing to treat them with respect and with understanding, whoever they are, even if they're politicians of whom you disapprove, whatever. In the end, the viewer is not particularly interested in my views. It's interested in the truth. So that's, I think, what one strives to try and deliver. It's a difficult balance. I don't know why I've managed to survive for so long, to be honest.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating because, I'm a normal person. I switch the news on and I see our newsreaders and I mean, there's a difference, I think, between being a news reader and a journalist, because, and I'd love you to explain perhaps how you got into journalism and how you got into news reading and which one came first. But I do find that I want a little bit of personality there somehow. I really do, simply because I think that because there are other mediums to receive the news now, we can go onto the websites and social media and so on, that actually to have a human being deliver something is really becoming quite a unique thing nowadays.
Well, it comes down to trust, I think, more than anything. And the degree to which they trust you to interrogate the truth that you are delivering. Has he done his job? Is he, I mean, I'm very lucky because obviously the format in which I work is a reasonably spacious one, in the sense that it's a 1-hour program. When I first started in commercial radio, the gobbets of news were so short that there was no likelihood that you'd ever had any time at all to interrogate anything. And you were just delivering words, reading. I was a news reader. I don't regard myself as a news reader now. I believe that you and I are going on a journey. And I've been trying to find out various elements of what I'm trying to present, or I and my team and the other people around me. It's obviously not a solo thing, but it's a team thing. But we do have the space. We only have one big program to work for every day. We're not having to be available every hour to update. We can devote the whole day to interrogating, one thing. I'm working on another story which might, interest you, which is the whole business of this helicopter that's going to be launched on Mars,
Oh,
and which
yeah.
is going to fly on a planet in which there's only 1% of the atmosphere that there is on Earth, and yet it is dependent on the atmosphere to fly. So theoretically,
Mm.
it can't possibly happen, but they're convinced it will.
Mm.
And who knows, by the time people listen to this, it will have happened, or indeed it won't. But anyway, there it is. And I discovered that the man in charge of this, of just the helicopter element, came from Gaza.
Oh my
Gaza
goodness.
being part of Palestine, a
Wow.
very impoverished and embattled and difficult arena to come from.
Mm.
And I thought, this is the most amazing story.
Absolutely.
And how did a man born in poverty and conflict arrive at a point at which somebody has trusted him to the point of taking a helicopter and landing the first time any craft has ever landed on Mars, and indeed, no, the whole thing's just incredible. And so I'm interested in the man even more than I am in the interested in the actual project. I'm only interested in the project in that it's complex and difficult and beyond science. Uh,
Mm.
and yet it is a man who was born in these very troubled circumstances and lived, until he was 20 in Gaza before getting a scholarship to a university in California, and then woof. Uh, and that I regard that as a pretty good example of quite a lot of what I do is try and dig out something that's really interesting and shines a light on an aspect of activity or news or information that
Mm.
nobody's thought of.
Absolutely. And I think it's exploring in a way not the obvious, not
Mm,
the,
mm,
the thing that we think you are going to report on,
mm,
but I
mm.
mean this man has a story, as you
Yes,
say, and and it's the most unlikely things that become so interesting.
but you put your finger on it because another journalist who would have perhaps had a scientific education or whatever would say, forget where the man comes from, for goodness sake. It's the whole process of how on earth you defeat the atmospheric need for the helicopter to fly and all that. Forget the guy. I mean, let's just have a look at the science. That's the
Mm,
mesmerizing thing. This is a first. The fact the man was born in Gaza is neither here nor there.
mm, mm.
It's fun, isn't it?
It is interesting, and it needs that raw hand, that
Yeah,
thinking, the
yeah.
person at the end of the day.
I mean, I think our duty as journalists is to interrogate everything we're asked to do. And very often we'll find that what is understood about the story is right. But then there are quite often times when you think, hang on a minute, has anyone ever looked at this bit?
Absolutely, and as I guess, trying to create a musical analogy, it's almost exploring what you don't see on the printed page, or exploring the sound beneath the surface of
Hmm,
the string or the skin or the key or whatever it might be. And that has to come from the individual, not from
hmm, hmm,
a tutor book or method book.
hmm. Which of
John,
course explains how people love specific musicians because of what they bring to the specific instrument they play. And that's why people love you.
oh heavens, I don't know about that, but it is interesting. And I guess going back to the social media aspect is that, a lot of the practice rooms are kitted out with tablets and one thing or another, iPads or whatever they're called, and for students to look up different performances of the
Hmm,
pieces they're learning. And yes, there are advantages to that, but there's an awful lot of disadvantages, I feel. Where's that curiosity and the questions that you have yourself, and that you're grappling with and, turning around in your sleep and so on. But
hmm, hmm.
really interesting. So I'm curious, John, as to how you went from a law student and then deciding to leave university and venturing into journalism.
Sadly, it was the university that decided I should leave the university.
Okay.
Um, so I went down in disgrace. And uh, I really was at a loss to know what on earth to do. I mean, initially, of course, I thought I must try and get in somewhere else, but I thought that's very unlikely. Um, and I had a very supportive cousin, my cousin Peter Snow, who is
Mm.
also a journalist, and he knew somebody who was at Oxford with him, and she, here we are, see family connections, but she said that she worked for somebody called Lord Longford, and Lord Longford was a big social reformer, and both eccentric and wonderful. Anyway, he had a day centre for homeless and vulnerable young people in London. And the guy who'd been running it had a nervous breakdown. And she said, look, he's looking for somebody to run this place. Shall I suggest you? And I said, oh, by all means, or little having the slightest understanding as how on earth I would deal with such troubled kids.
Mm.
But it was in Covent Garden. No, the original one was in Soho. No, I was summoned to Soho, to the day centre, and there waiting to interview me with a view to whether I could actually have the job or not was Lord Longford, Jack Perfumer of the Perfumer scandal,
Mm.
and Rear Admiral Sir Matthew Slattery, who was the head of British Airways, or British Overseas Airways.
My gosh.
And they grilled me, and I got the job. And for 3 years, I threw my everything into leading this place of great suffering and deprivation. It was a terrible time on the drug scene. A lot of kids were using barbiturates, heroin, etc.
Mm.
Work was not plentiful, and but we developed a fabulous team of about a dozen people. We managed to get residential accommodation, etc., as well as the day centre, and it was amazing work. But at the end of it all, I was exhausted and
Mm.
needed to do something else. And it was the birth of commercial radio. LBC, London Broadcasting, was the first commercial radio station. And the self-same cousin, Peter Snow, said, you should put in for that. I thought, well, really? So I did. And interestingly, their problem was that the only people who'd ever worked in commercial radio were people from New Zealand, from Australia, from America, from Canada, but nobody from Britain.
Oh,
And they needed somebody who would deliver the news on LBC, which was, after all, a sort of news station,
Mm.
who wouldn't necessarily be a transatlantic or, colonial voice. And so I got the job, just reading the news. But of course, it was only a few months before I broke out and started reporting. And my greatest boon, which it is to this day, is having a bicycle. In those days, the IRA was bombing its way across London,
Of course.
and the traffic would back up. There'd be panic, there'd be fire engines, all the rest of it. But you could nip through on your bike and get right to the seat of the crime. And we had walkie-talkies that we used to broadcast on. So I'd actually be pedaling along, and so I could see the smoke, and it was quite sort of dramatic stuff. And all I did was, I didn't know anything at all. What I did know is what I could see. So I reported what I could see. And that was the beginning of my reporting life.
And I suppose what you could see and what you could feel as well. I mean, the senses being a large part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was my break into journalism.
So it seems in a way that you're pretty fearless. You seem to have planted yourselves in situations, of thinking, well, I don't know anything about this, but I'll give it a go. I don't know anything about this, but I'll give it a go. And is this a large part of who you are, willing to explore the unknown, push the barriers?
This is the gorgeous thing about it. Ignorance was by far the best equipment. Once you accepted to yourself that you knew nothing, then everything was an exploration and had to be checked and the rest of it. And that actually makes you not a bad journalist, actually. You haven't taken anything for granted. And you haven't sort of thought, well, I think it was this, or I saw somewhere it was that. And no, if you were going to succeed, and I knew how ignorant I was, you needed to check stuff and really. And the other thing was, you tried to get to the actual source who could tell you what was going on, the policeman, the vicar, whoever it was, the doctor, who could, fill in what you didn't know of what was happening.
And I suppose it goes back to what you were mentioning about the gentleman from Gaza and the Mars is sourcing those people, the little bits and pieces that make that story come alive.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're blessed with wonderful human beings who are all different and very often have an absolutely wonderful individual story to tell. And they may not be very good at telling it, but you can do that. They need just to supply you with the facts and the information that has affected whatever it is that they're doing that you're reporting upon.
So you have your mother's piano. Do you still have your bike?
I have a better bike than I had then, but I certainly do, absolutely. And I ride every day. I ride to and from work and at work, within reason. I mean, there's no point living in a great city like London if you can't move around. And the one thing about a bicycle is you can move anywhere as long as you've got a bit of puff.
And with your experience, certainly as a newsreader, I would say, are you in a position whereby you're asked to advise on how to newsread, if you know what I mean, or little tips here and there for future
Rarely, interestingly, very rarely. I mean, nobody's approached me like I approached my cousin. But no, it's interesting. I think the awful thing is that most of us who ever get to the point of being able to read the news, which I find a rather banal description of what we actually do, because we are involved in writing it and shaping it and checking it and sometimes making it. But no, very few people have ever come up to me and said, how do I do this, that, or the other? And actually, you can't really tell them, except to be yourself. Don't pretend to be somebody else.
And that's interesting what you've said, is that I hadn't fully realized that a newsreader would in fact write, a substantial amount of the material that is said.
Well,
and
it depends what you're really talking about, because there are people who really are presenters of news and not involved really in interrogating much. I think where I work, you're much more part of a machine that is interrogating everything that we do. But we've got space to do it because it's not a 10-minute news, it is an hour. And that actually gives you a freedom that, very few people enjoy.
Absolutely. And have there been moments when perhaps you've been at a particular scene and you're watching history unfold, and it's in a way crossed your mind that you could actually affect what's happening, what's going to happen?
I don't think you get as constructed as that. I think what happens is you see something which you're convinced nobody else has seen and nobody's reported on, and it's a vital element of what you're looking at. I mean, we could go back to the Gaza man, and we could say, well, there will be a lot of people who've not been to Gaza and for whom Gaza won't mean anything. His background doesn't matter at all. The point is he's an American. I mean, he is now. I mean, he's an American citizen, and he talks, oh, Jesus, we're doing this, etc. I mean, you'd never know. You'd never know. And it was a fragment that I picked up from somebody else who said something like, I think somebody who knew that I had worked a lot in Gaza, and I think they just said, oh, and by the way, his family came from Gaza. Anyway, I mean, it's all part of the job.
It is really. And you mentioned that your cousin, Peter, And of course, your nephew,
Yeah, Dan,
Dan, our history man,
yeah.
extraordinary. I mean, what's the best piece of advice they, or either one of them, have given to you?
Well, it's an interesting thing to list them because both Dan and Peter are extremely bright and have very, very good degrees. The misfit is the one in the middle. It's me, because I don't even have a degree, as we spelt out. And
But can they
uh,
sing?
well, I might have the edge on them for that. Yeah. Um, so ask me the question again. I got carried away thinking
I
about the
just,
fact that they were
I
so good and I'm so bad.
no, away you go. But has there been a piece of advice that perhaps Peter or indeed Dan have given to you, or vice versa? That is,
Actually,
it,
no, not really, not
no.
really, because uh, all Peter did was to throw me a lifeline and said, "Get on with it." And there's no point getting on with it and and carrying on even though you're not up to it. You've got to prove yourself that he can't do any more than
Mm,
that. And so, I mean, you could say it was nepotism, but it wasn't really. He just gave me a tip, and then we got
yeah.
going. And
Mm.
of course, there is obviously the danger that somebody's going to say, "Well, uh, Peter's pretty good, so I guess John will be all right." And, and maybe it happened to Dan too. I doubt because he's such a very bright guy.
He's extraordinary as well. I mean, all
Yeah.
three of you are. It's extraordinary that within that one family, that
Mm.
three major figures, have really influenced our lives.
Yes, yes, it is. It is interesting.
And
Yeah.
do you think that there's been an event or events whereby you've reported on that really stand out and have affected you personally?
Wow. I mean, there've been so many.
Mm,
Visiting Chernobyl after all that,
goodness.
really shattering to see what humankind is capable of generating by his and her mistakes. Um, so many things.
Mm,
I went to there was a big, massive, great oil tanker that crashed into the Normandy coast called the Torrey Canyon,
mm,
and a few people died on that, and it defoliated the whole coastline and that sort of thing. And then wars, endless wars,
mm,
wars in Gaza, wars in Iraq. I've been to Iran a lot, which is a absolute. I mean, I feel blessed to have been to Iran, and yet obviously it's a place of immense tension because of the collision between the United States and their view of the world and Islamic fundamentalists in Iran who have another version of the world.
mm.
Actually, the amazing thing is that you can go there and almost be oblivious of the terrible tension that surrounds them because they're absolutely wonderful people and you can understand how Persia was such a brilliant um, civilization, the Persian civilization,
Mm.
uh, because they're imbued some way with a wonderful streak of brilliance. And it shows even to this day, despite the fact that, of course, some of it's been put to a terrible end, like nuclear development
Mm,
and
mm,
attitudes towards law and order.
mm. I mean, do you hope that do you feel optimistic about the world, about society, about how we're moving forward? I know it's probably almost impossible to say or to condense it in a few words, but we're
But you're
constantly,
asking me in a time of pandemic. You're
yeah,
asking me something
yes,
when a pandemic has inflicted upon us thoughts of our frailty, our vulnerability, our danger, what we're doing to the planet. What role did we play in generating this pandemic? Who knows? I mean, and we bully our planet. We do terrible things to it. I think it's almost impossible. Here's a bold thing to say. I think it's almost impossible to be a committed reporter and not recognize that our greatest danger is global warming and abuse of the planet. We have to sort ourselves out. So much of what is happening is happening because we have created the potential for it to happen. I mean, I can't tie the exact link between the pandemic and me. I didn't get it, obviously, but at the same time, did I play a part in bringing it about? Did I consume things I shouldn't have consumed in terms of, did we allow ourselves to go in a particular direction which affected the welfare of Earth? Have we allowed ourselves to be too abusive? I don't know. I mean, but I have found that the pandemic had generated a kind of introspection that I've never thought I was likely to participate in.
And do you think that there can be hope that we can build on this? So out of the tragedy of the pandemic, and I'm a great believer in sort of yin and yang, you know, we might have to endure something, but from that other things sprout through and so on. But, you know, do you really feel we can all listen to ourselves? Because ultimately it's our own actions. You know, I guess, you know, as a musician, and you'll completely understand this, in order to learn a piece, you go step by step by step, note by note by note by note. And rather than looking at this great big piece thinking, oh my Lord, how am I going to negotiate this? But these small steps that make a difference, you know, these little actions, surely we can maybe begin to give ourselves a chance to listen.
I do. I am an optimist. I may have sounded rather pessimistic in listing those threats, but I do believe we're capable of being better to ourselves than we are, being better to our planet than we are. But it will take leadership as well. You know, we have to have people who will lead us, and those leaders need to understand who we are and what we believe and what we feel and what we experience, and it needs to be a joint project between us all. I do think, and I'm not a scientist, that the pandemic is in some way related to our bullying of the planet.
And do you think that the leaders that we do have are leaders whereby they can really connect with people's situations? I mean, not all of us can, of course we can't, because we have the upbringing that we have and so on, but it's, you can read about things but not feel it. And do you feel that they're, I mean, for you as a journalist, you are, as you've so brilliantly explained, you know, exploring all these nooks and crannies and fishing out the non-obvious things that make that story something that we can feel. There's emotion there, there's an avenue of understanding there, and an avenue whereby we think, oh, well, hold on a second, we ask questions of ourselves. And for some reason I struggle sometimes with the leaderships, because of where is that avenue to truly feel, rather than it just being words, but to feel a situation. And I say this simply because, you know, we're constantly in the arts world, you know, trying to put our case forward as regards to music education or whatever, and trying to put forward the positives, the essentials of the arts in our lives. And it's sometimes hard to get that. Now, it could just simply be because we're just not adequate at putting our case forward. But I do worry sometimes about, huge issues.
Mm. Well, I think maybe we ask too much of our leaders or expect too much of our leaders,
I
and we
agree.
need to work harder ourselves, and we need to be
Mm,
more receptive to what's going on and
mm,
more active in trying to redress imbalance. Um, I'm very struck by the fact that if you were to lay a map of deprivation in Britain, inequality, and then you laid another map of the outbreak of the pandemic on top of that map, the two would elide. Now, of course,
mm,
there are some well-off people who have suffered in the pandemic, but they are a tiny minority compared with the vast wave of people who have suffered, who
mm,
tend not to be of the more privileged people in the country.
mm, mm. It's very interesting, isn't it, really? Can you imagine that your home work life may change now with the arrival of your son, but
Oh,
also
I
the
think, yes, I think it's inevitable. Yes, absolutely.
yes, and
And also, I'm getting old, I mean,
oh,
uh,
away,
talk away. I like
not at
that.
all.
Yeah,
No, and also I think with the the different ways that we can work now, which a lot of it is done
sure.
virtually, and
Yeah.
and this must be a nice positive thing for you to be at home.
Well, you see, for example, we had to be in work at, you know, 9:30 for the meeting, but we've been meeting on Zoom and I'm wondering whether that's our sort of start of the day, Zoom. Um, and I wonder whether we're really going to go on going in it, because it's a very long day. It's up to, it becomes kind of leave home at 9, get home at 9. We'll
Hugely
also,
long day.
yeah, yeah,
Yep, yep. I think we'll all be revising, I think, or
I think,
readdressing,
yeah.
and this surely can help the planet as well,
Sure. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think we need to swear to ourselves that we won't go back to exactly what we had before. That in some way we'll
Yeah.
use this experience to build ourselves a better and more considerate world.
Mm. John, it's been an absolute pleasure. There are so many things I would still like to ask, but I'm very conscious of your time that you've given so generously to me. And it's been absolutely fascinating and such a privilege to meet you in this way. We have to be thankful for technology in many, many ways, and it's certainly provided this opportunity. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Evelyn, for uh, even thinking of having a conversation with me. I would have loved to have spent the entire time talking to you about what you do and how indeed you prevailed. I've read a certain amount uh, about it, but nevertheless, it's just wonderful to communicate with you in this way, and yet to know that it has been achieved by all sorts of miraculous uh, methodology of one sort or another.